Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Hello, this is Adam House coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thanks so much for listening. The Organic Wine Podcast is brought to you by Centralis Wine. Centralis is my winery based here in central Los Angeles, where we've converted our urban lot into a permaculture wine garden that we call Crenshaw Crew. I started Centralis as an ecologically centered winery because I realized that whether you want to be or not, you are a farmer, and the vineyard doesn't end at the edge of the rows of vines. You can buy our wines and learn more at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. And if you join our wine club, you'll get access to our Crenshaw Crew wines. Aaron Brown and Colin Blackshear of Bardos Cider are my guests for this episode. This is their first podcast, and I'm honored to be able to spread the word about the remarkable work that they are doing. They have built Bardos Cider since 2019 to a significant production of over 150 barrels by gleaning fruit from abandoned, forgotten, and derelict old orchards in Northern California. Orchards that were planted in the late 1800s and early 1900s. These trees have learned to survive only on the winter rains and despite human neglect, and this has made their fruit all the more exciting with age. Working with them has connected Aaron and Colin to the history of this land in some very meaningful and even spiritual ways. They clearly have a humility and respect for the wisdom of these elder beings that they work with, and through cider they've begun to realize a larger responsibility they have to protect and preserve these orchards. So often wine and cider are produced from an egotistical standpoint. I decided I wanted to make a certain kind of wine or cider, so I found or planted vineyards or orchards to meet my specifications and invested my will and desires and resources into bringing my ego vision to reality. When this is my approach, is the wine or cider that I end up with really a reflection of the terroir or just my ego? Colin and Aaron of Bardos Cider remind me that there is another approach. I could instead look to work in service of what is already thriving without my ego, despite that it may not be exactly what I thought I wanted or had in mind or intended. I could work to highlight and preserve the beautiful work that was already being done before me and that will continue on once I'm gone. Could this lead to a truer reflection of place? And if applied to my entire life more broadly, is this the kind of perspective that could lead to abundance? This recording begins with a conversation already in progress. Enjoy!
When we started, we worked with this character, Yeti, who sort of introduced us to the first orchards that we worked with. He's a farmer who has run a lot of different farms around California in the past few decades, and has sort of developed a lot of more kind of intuitive practices of farming, and I think learning from him, you begin to realize what sort of works and what doesn't in different disciplines up in to where we are now. There was this sort of we've kind of there's the kind of Amigo Bob school who we've kind of crossed paths with. That's up, in the gold country and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And then there is, of course, Sebastopol. There's a lot of farming communities and disciplines that have developed their own approaches, and then other areas of California, and basically what we've kind of, or where we feel like we are right now is sort of with apples, there isn't really a discipline that we can sort of apply completely to apples in order to make wine or cider, and that's the sort of thing that we're having to kind of unpack, is how to sort of appreciate and respect where we've got to at this point, with organic farming, biodynamics, permaculture and stuff, but at the same time realized that those sort of farming practices don't totally apply to old orchards, which is the where our interest lies, because it makes better wine or cider, because essentially it isn't really farmed. They've gone derelict,
Well,
or in a sense
yeah,
abandoned in terms of traditional farming approaches. And then, yeah, I could kind of start from the beginning, but
yeah. Well,
the
I'm
sort of
so we're
paradox right now.
It's I love just jumping right in.
Hmm.
But yeah, just to give context, we were talking about this idea of permaculture, the word permaculture,
Hmm.
and the caveats around that, and the sort of ideas that it's really an outgrowth of ancient traditions and ideas and wisdom that has just a new label and can be approached from a lot of different ways, intuitive versus sort of the permaculture design courses that are out there, and um, all this tying back into what you guys do. And so let's just jump right back to that sort of as a starting point of what do you guys do? Who are you and what do you do?
Uh, Colin, Aaron, and my brother Evan and Colin's wife Jackie make Bardos Cider, which up till now is a cider project, but we've started to branch out and do co-ferments and stuff with different winemakers and some breweries and other sort of projects and ideas like that.
How long have you guys been? Has Bardos existed?
Our first vintage was 2019.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Same
but it
as
was
same as us. Yeah.
yeah, it was a hobby, and I started making cider in England. I was over there for a little while, and that's where the sort of the historic lens kind of appeared, because sort of fell in with some cider makers in Somerset, Herefordshire, out in Wales, and then kind of followed the clues up to Yorkshire, and just around areas in the UK, and was really in admiration of the lifestyle of these people. And
What about it? Like how so?
well, they were sort of very metaphysical. They didn't really uh, use big words. They were they're engaged with the land. There was they would be pressing juice and kind of like stick their hand in it and taste it and sort of nod or shake their head, and it felt very poetic and intuitive and mysterious and simple, and every day they were doing it, and there were people who were looked 90 years old, just sitting around and enjoying their lives and interfacing with nature and stuff. um, and it sort of reminded me of growing up in Sonoma. Colin and I went to Sonoma High and reconnected over the cider project, but it was like Sonoma was just so corporate and so just starved of soul. I think
Yeah.
we hated wine culture.
Yeah.
And since some peers have started doing wine that is relatable, but I kind of well, I just there was something about the cider makers that reminded me of these old photos you'd see, like the old wine people in the 70s, like black and white photos sitting in a diner at 4 a.m. with dirty and cowboy hats
Mm.
and stuff, and that seemed cool, and I could relate to that. But the what us millennials sort of received was just this really corporate kind of parody of wine culture. Um, so the cider thing almost seemed like a subversive rebellion, because coming back to California, there were all these abandoned orchards, and it was like this virtually free stuff. And if you did it the way that they did it in Europe, you didn't use any yeast or sulfites. It was all wild fermentation, and in England they would focus on the abandoned uh, Victorian orchards. So you'd kind of just knock on doors and stuff, and
Mm.
basically just brought that paradigm back. And there's all these abandoned historic orchards around California, you would basically call them homestead orchards, or turn of the century orchards. And so coming back, started doing that, and then that's how Colin and I reconnected, because we're both kind of interested in this kind of sort of psychogeographical overlay of history. The problem with the United States is you start digging in history around here, and it gets real kind of challenging. You could say there's a lot of kind of like sadness and stuff.
Tragedy.
So of course, that takes you back to this indigenous lens too,
Yeah.
which you could talk a lot more about. But just to kind of go full circle, that's where biodynamics and permaculture gets a little funny, is because these are appropriated concepts
Right.
from Australia or Europe, and as inspired as they are, they sort of arrest your own agency sometimes to really attune yourself to your environment and understand what your kind of human relationship is with plants and animals and the the earth and stuff. So it's not to put down any paradigms, but it's almost like we're not. Sometimes we want to feel like we're done, but we certainly aren't done. In terms of figuring out how these different life forms work together.
Yeah, that's really well said.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, in North America, we can really see this sort of detachment from the land and the environment that the indigenous people have had stewarded for since time immemorial, and give us 150 years to suddenly you know
raise it.
yeah. So I mean, there's a narrative where the indigenous, people talk about indigenous cultures retrospectively, which is very disrespectful, because there's more than ever, indigenous people in the United States. So it's really a matter of kind of getting those dialogues, back in the foreground, and how these lands were stewarded, and how we can sort of reintegrate that wisdom. I would say that would be the step after permaculture and organic and biodynamics and stuff.
Yeah, those are sort of gateway to start paying attention to
Yeah.
to the how, maybe I don't know if this is a good question for Colin. Just wanted to hear from Colin, but you were talking about how that applies to or doesn't apply to tending these old orchards, and can either of you talk more about that? Like, what does that mean? What are you learning about them? And why is that? Is it because these aren't indigenous plants, obviously apple trees?
No.
Why is it, like, what are you learning, and why is it different?
Well, maybe I can, go back for a moment in terms of my connection and reconnection with Aaron. And,
That'd be great. Yeah.
I came to Sonoma when I was in elementary school with my mom after, she split with my dad, and came from a city life. In our backyard, there was kind of a food forest of apricots and plums and grapes. That I just had an instant love of these old fruits that were kind of emerging from our backyard. And, so that's where my love of, fruit trees sort of spawned. And now, at my house, I also have a food forest. I moved away from Sonoma and, just working all the time, not paying attention to, the food that I put in my body, and ended up moving back to Sonoma and really became kind of focused on planting food and learning about the soil, and sort of coming to the realization that soil is really the basis of any quality thriving fruit, in my experience at least. And so when Aaron and I reconnected, he had been making cider, and I just have this fascination with fruit trees, and we started searching out apple trees in the neighborhood, and he told me about scrumpy, which is an English term, or maybe not an English term, but came from your time in England, Aaron, and
Mm-hmm.
collecting kind of the random apples from the neighborhood and making juice and fermenting it into cider. And so we started doing that, in our, within Sonoma, finding old trees, and there's something about older trees that have just been established, dry farming, if you can get a tree to a place where you don't need to water it and it's just surviving, then there's some magic behind that. And that really is
Yeah.
what spawned our Bardos collaboration, and it's been kind of a giant experiment. But finding old orchards, there's Aaron and I both have kind of a strong passion for California history, and there's a lot to it. But the fact that there are these old orchards that gold miners went off and planted that still exist today. So there's sort of a treasure hunt aspect to finding these old unused apples,
Mm.
so that the historical component is really what drives my passion for the project.
Mm. Now, how have the trees been doing the last couple of years up there?
It's hard to really tell. I mean, with
So you haven't had like a decline in production from them, or
well, as Colin and I have experienced, there's there's the bumper crop concept. So these really old trees.
right?
So one year they do vegetative growth, the other year they do fruit. So really, it's all sort of retrospective.
Right. You have to have like a lot of data going back a few
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
Got it.
And of course, there'll be big die outs, because these things are old. But
Yeah.
they've also lived a really long time. Some of them are over 100 years old, haven't been irrigated or really farmed, at all. Have gone through decades of neglect. Um, kind of back to what Colin was saying, though. The I think what really projected the both of us into this were these stories of horticulturalists who were just sort of coming out and experimenting with different varietals of all different kinds, and from Luther Burbank in Sonoma County to Albert Eder up in Humboldt to the Humboldt cider people are working on preserving some of that experimental orchard up out in the Lost Coast. And then there was the Amigo Bob and Adams project, the Felix Chalet Institute up in Nevada City, which was really inspiring. And you sort of fall in with these people, and you're knocking on doors, hopping, basically hopping fences, sort of getting scions and of weird varietals that were planted 100 years ago as experiments, and are probably the only, in some cases, the only version of that varietal in the world, but they've been living on their own because they were developed for this climate.
Yeah. Wow.
So in a sense, as we continue to do this, to credit the varietals themselves feels a little bankrupt, because what's really creating the personality of this fruit and wine is the environment and the soil. Like Colin was saying, just, if not more than the varietals, I think we could make a superior cider from a ancient Gravenstein tree than a farmed Kingston Black. I think,
Yeah.
and that was something I've heard. I can't remember. Now I'm going to forget it. It's somebody up in the Finger Lakes, a cider maker, said the same thing about Macintosh.
Oh, like an ancient Macintosh, like a
Yeah, would be better than the best farmed cider
cider
varietal.
apple. Yeah.
So we've really leaned into that, and I think what's been fun with Bardos is that California, at least Northern California, is, well, Southern California obviously too, is such an arid climate. So when Burbank came out, he came for the sandy loam, because it was so easy to grow things, and the climate in Sebastopol, and so these trees just live pretty happily on their own, and and because of the dry sort of Mediterranean climate, they're sort of on the one hand stressed, but on the other hand content. So they have really expressive fruit, when they're not micromanaged or overwatered. Because on the East Coast in Europe, they just get a lot more water.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what Colin and I have messed around with, especially when we first started, with Derek Trowbridge, there's not a lot of acid in the apples, whereas on the East Coast there are. So we really started messing around with maceration to get oxidative acid, and that's been a pretty serious tool for us, making cider. And that was something that wasn't really, I didn't really clock in Europe. It was just kind of coming back here, and actually meeting winemakers. I think talked a little trash on wine in the beginning, but when I came back and fell in with Colin, is old friends with like Ross Kennard and Nick Hattori and these kind of cool, the cool people in Sonoma. So Colin kind of, opened up these doors of getting, kind of thinking wine is cool again, and farming and all this stuff. I don't know, Colin, if you have any more to say about what you all were doing, or what you talk about as friends. But
I mean, it's mainly just the idea of farming in general is there's kind of the old ways of doing things pre-industrial revolution, focusing on the soil, not spraying poison on your food. um,
Crazy idea.
basic.
Crazy ideas like that.
Yeah, and I just happen to be friends with some creative farming types, and we always talk about food, and I don't know, it's just part of life. Basic stuff. Not sure what to say other than
Well, let me.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. The question is a real simple one, but can you talk about your brand, like the name Bardos, and sort of some of the the stuff that's on your website, for example? And I can prompt you, but start with like the name Bardos, and the sort of the labels that you guys used to use, and where does that come from?
yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's a sort of a combination of the linear sort of colonial historical stuff that is interesting, but then also the nonlinear, spiritual stuff also, because as people of European ancestry in North America, you're always kind of torn between these sort of shame and pride, and this constant pinging, um, of really remarkable stories, but also like, wait, was that remarkable story actually like an atrocity? I don't, you can kind of, there's different ways to look at stuff, and I think Colin and I have found refuge in sort of like, being able to create a container to kind of live acknowledging both, channels, you could say, which there's probably more than just those two. But
Yeah.
it's essentially the word Bardos. Growing up in Sonoma, there's a feed store called Bracco's, and it has just kind of like a cowboy sounding word.
Yeah.
So Bardos sounded like that, but of course Bardos is it's a very kind of conceptual, alchemical, mystical word. It's Tibetan, of the sort of in between states. Um, there's different bardos in between life states. So essentially, I think the idea of wine is you're capturing, as a very charged spirit in between, plant life form and human life form, and it's been it is a very spiritual substance because it's very charged and it gets you high and you feel youthful or connected in certain ways. So it's kind of just playing with those
Yeah, I like
concepts.
that.
Mm.
Yeah, I like that. I like the code that you guys developed for, I guess, on your labels to be able to, identify what's in the bottle without alerting the TTB.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so of course they look kind of witchy and they're little alchemy symbols. That was just because we encountered the fact that the wine lobbyists, you're technically not allowed to put varietals or like AVA or any of that stuff. Although we found that we can sometimes. It just depends on I'm sure you've experienced. Depends on who
Yeah,
you
yeah,
get.
yeah.
But so we kind of played it like like we were witches and you had to sort of talk in alchemical code in order to, or else we'd be
Right.
taken down by the bureaucracy or the church and state or something.
I want more of that. That's fun.
Uh-huh.
Well, I don't want it. I don't want it in reality. It seems like our country could be heading in that direction, which would not be good.
Well,
But
yeah. I mean, it's really a like Phil. There's a lot of clues. Like we really just need to like be our own agents, and really take this farming like working with the land and the plants. We can't rely on systems. We can again. It's like we can acknowledge the systems and where they've got us, but we really need to work intuitively. I mean and then connecting with Colin. I mean he's very intuitive. We get out there and it's like it's very magical. It's a very profound magical experience being around these plants and stuff, and it feels like just the beginning. Hopefully,
yeah. Well, can you go a little bit into that? Like, any specific instances or specific impressions that you've had while you've been out there working, or just getting back to that. Like, what are you doing with the vineyards besides going and picking up apples once a year?
I mean, there was one orchard this last season that we found, and I want to say it was planted in 1920. It was the lady who lived there. It was her father or grandfather's maybe, and it had just been completely overgrown with oak trees, and all these apple trees were basically buried in other plant life. So
Mm.
we went out there, and Aaron and I spent quite a bit of time chainsawing, just sort of bringing the sunlight back to these old trees, and
Mm.
that's just one example. But being in the orchard itself is just kind of a magical experience. There's not nobody's really there. So there's a solitude, and there's wildlife. There's just layers of history when you're out there, so a lot of room to dream.
It sounds like if you have lots of, oaks overgrowing apples, it's a beautiful, probably spot for animals. Lots of food and forage for other creatures besides humans.
Absolutely.
Um, nice. So how does this? How big is your production at this point?
we have okay. So that's a good liaison from the last question. So basically, the deals we've sort of worked out is we will commit to an orchard, and each one is totally different than the other in terms of arrangements. Where we, in some cases, will go out and get the fruit. In other cases, the property owner will have people that they feel comfortable doing
Mm.
that. So we'll kind of come help, but really defer to the property owners. It could be a groundskeeper, it could be somebody that does various kinds of work on the property for a long time. So we just kind of negotiate these handshake deals, but typically the way they pan out is we take everything and then we prop and sort of clean up dead growth is the MO. So we take the fruit we want, clean up any fruit that's left, maybe rotting, because these orchards get really messy. So it's something that the property owners typically like, is if we help clean up. So we'll take the fruit, we'll pay the their people if necessary, or we'll get friends to help. And I mean, you kind of know the drill there, but
Yeah.
but then sometimes you turn around and there's 30 tons of fruit, and so you are, you then have to figure out what's next. So the 2020 vintage, there's 120 barrels sitting in a winery that
Wow.
we have aged because it's a paycheck to paycheck project right now, and so we're sort of waiting to bottle that, and we still have a good amount of 2020 left. But also, we've up until now we've really only done bottle conditioning, or sort of either a form of pet nat or dosage it with next vintage's fresh juice. So really, we'll do 2021 with 2022's juice, probably. I would think.
Right, because it's I'm sure still at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as wine. It ferments out. I mean,
Yeah.
in a
Well,
couple
that's
5 days.
I was going to ask about that. Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to ask about. Like, how are you getting sparkle at that point?
Yeah. The other thing is, we had the harvest of apples is much broader than grapes. It's first week of
Right.
August is Gravenstein, and then it goes all the way into November or December if there's still stuff on the trees hanging there.
Right. So you can use some of that later juice to throw back in. Now, do you have trouble with getting re-ferments happening once it's, especially if it's been, like, if you're putting 2022 into 2021, like, I imagine the yeast have pretty much all gone silent at that point, and you don't have a lot of microbial activity, even if you're not adding sulfur or filtering, just by aging.
Yeah, we've been lucky enough to work with some, pretty, again, starting with Derek. Now we're in a space with Dan Person, who does Carbonista, who's just a master at sparkling wines.
Okay.
So basically, it's almost like bread, where you get the fresh juice, you get it going,
Right.
get a big, healthy head on it just by letting it sit out. Then you sort of feed it into a blending tank with the wine.
Got
and
it.
if you really want to do it right, you're like a baker, where you sort of do it
A little bit
every
and
couple
a little bit more.
hours or something.
Yeah. And do you have to, I imagine there's some math that's involved where you're measuring, you've got the still wine, which is like negative bricks, and then you're adding in something that's fermenting at X bricks, and you want X pressure going into bottles. So you have to sort of measure how much of that fresh juice is being blended in.
Yeah, typically you want it to be like 1/2 to 1. I mean, I think some people get into more sugar per gram, that sort of measuring, because bricks is sort of a rough.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah.
But I mean, then other people will do 10%. So it depends on how. We've had a lot of success with that ratio, 10% fresh juice.
But we do take in fresh juice, and we test the sugar levels, and then we are doing precise math to get it where we hopefully need it to be.
So where you have fizz but not bombs, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the bombs, the bombs can come, a lot will say from, not filtering too, and not disgorging, because we don't disgorge. So there's a lot of sediment, so it's still alive in there. One time we, probably the most bomb-like one, is because we had fresh juice in cold storage, kind of waiting till the bottling line was ready. And we brought it over, and in juice, when you refrigerate stuff, the the water and the more solid, unfiltered part will start to separate, like in fresh apple juice. Like if you freeze
Right.
fresh apple juice, you always want to wait for all of it to thaw, because the sugars in the water sort of separate. So
you make Applejack.
well, the scorpion test we got back was like the top of the tote,
Oh,
and all the
okay.
sugar
Yeah.
had sort of settled at the bottom. So we kind of did it wrong, so that there's a lot more sugar in the juice than our.
The moral of the
Did
story is
Yeah.
to stir the juice.
Stir the
And you didn't. Did you like actually break glass? Were things actually
No.
exploding?
No.
Okay, just when you opened it, you had explosions, basically.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
Yeah, if it's not 35 degrees, it's gonna come out of the top for that one cuvee. But then other times, we'll really kind of push the maceration too far, and it'll get a lot of VA. So then the yeast just kind of really can't carbonate the wine either. So it's a very kind of dramatic living bottle of cider.
Got it.
So those are the two extremes.
Okay.
Yeah, but
that's pretty. I mean, that's pretty much the gist. Are you doing anything more complex than that? I mean, I know you guys are kind of just trying to reflect that where these cool old orchards. So I know your approach is pretty minimal, but is there anything more complicated? Or just something that you're doing experimentally?
I would just chime in here that Bardos is very experimental in general. So not only are Aaron and I learning as we go from others, and we're collaborating with other people throughout our process, and just having that spirit of experimentation is what's exciting. So we're trying new things. We're talking about not only these methods that we're talking about, but adding in different other fruits or other herbs, or these co-ferments, really trying to explore these sort of new realms of the co-ferment world. I mean, it's interesting to me. We did one collaboration with Wavy Wines, which was grapes and apples, but what else is possible out there in this sort of wine cider making world? Or
yeah, I mean, right, there's lots, right?
and beer. I mean, so my girlfriend Hayden and I will sort of walk through the creek in the summer and get plums and mugwort and rose petals, or just whatever is in the neighborhood, and then macerate the plums in a bucket, and then make some tea out of the mugwort and rose petals or something, and then maybe there's a quince you grind up, or some rose hips or something. Colin and I did a good quince rose hip cider that was pretty crazy. But things like that. So there was this one they were doing where it was basically plums and these sort of herbal teas. You get, but then the fermentation grabs. You put an airlock on it, and then you leave it, and then it's like, what is it? It's not. Is it? It's sort of water. It's like a tisane, and like a fruit. Fruit is the yeast and the sugar. I mean, I'm sure there's yeast on the plants, so
right.
it's really good. It tastes more like a sour beer than anything else I could really put my finger on. But yeah, I mean, the frontier is wide open. I mean, it's pretty neat what's going on, and people's palates are ready for now. I mean, it's pretty exciting.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Yeah, that's what I'm finding as well. I mean, and I don't know how niche my world is, so it's nice to hear somebody else, but yeah, of course you probably fit right into that niche that I'm interested in. So but I agree. I think I've seen more and more of that, more and more openness and expansion of palates, and hunger, thirst is probably the better word for something that isn't the same thing that we've been drinking for the last 70 years.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I will say apples and grapes, just as a kind of as a foundation fruit, they really get whatever you're doing a lot further than, I've experienced with just plums or something. But,
right.
like you were
There
saying
is
about
a
the
reason.
oranges. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a reason that they are, as popular and have these huge ancient traditions behind them.
Hmm.
Yeah, they do well in many ways. And yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, even we're working with prickly pears
Yeah.
here because that's, our indigenous sort of juicy fruit down here. And yeah, I mean, you just, like, the chemistry is all crazy. It's like, the easiest thing to do is just add it to grapes, add it into some nice white grapes or something like
Yeah,
that, where,
exactly.
you're getting the balance of everything else going there. I mean, you can certainly make a prickly pear thing by itself, but there's, I don't
Like
know.
you,
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe
you nailed
maybe
it
I'm
when you
just
said
learning.
peeving, though, because you want to kind of starve it and keep some RS on there to keep, because it
Yeah,
almost,
that's
its personality goes away. It doesn't. There's no plum
right.
left, or there's no prickly pear
Right.
left, or orange, or
Exactly. Yeah,
um,
it's like you lose that sort of. I mean, with prickly pears, you lose like there's a like a I don't even eat candy, but like the juicy fruit. I mean, it's this super crazy tropical fun thing, and then you taste it, and you're like, oh, this is like gin. Once it's fermented,
yeah,
it's more botanical and like completely herbal, and all that tropical stuff is gone. I mean, it's
yeah,
still good. It's just you're like, oh, I liked that stuff too, and it would be great to have all of that
yeah.
somehow. Um, yeah, and rose hips. It's funny you mentioned rose hips. I've been playing around with those too. Those, I mean, if I'm correct, I think they're part of. I mean, I think roses and apples
Uh-huh.
are essentially part of the same family,
Yeah,
right? They're like a rose hip is essentially a tiny little apple,
yeah.
and you bite
Like a
into it,
crab
and it has
apple.
yeah, it tastes like it. And it's got the seeds in it, just like an apple. It's funny. Um,
Yeah, ours,
what
I think we put too many rows. I mean, again, you don't want to put that much in there.
very tannic, right?
Yeah, and God, it tasted just like emergency kind of. It tasted medicinal. It was like very fruity, but it had
Right.
uh, not to, yeah, it had a kind of a medicinal.
Well, that's interesting. And maybe it would be good to sort of balance something that's kind of a more flat fruit, like a dessert apple or something like that, where
Hmm.
you're giving some of that texture
Hmm.
to the blend.
Yeah.
That might be fun. All right, we'll get work on some
Well,
ideas.
and
I
then,
like that.
of course, there's so many kinds of rose hips that look dramatically different than others. So you'd want to sort of
Right.
uh, understand um,
Right.
the
What
differences
they
there.
are.
I remember in
Yeah.
Europe they would have rose hip like like a syrup for like pancakes type things and stuff, and there's not as much maple syrup over there, so they have these. I would see rose hip syrup everywhere, and it's amazing. I mean, it's a
Oh, interesting.
really concentrated source of vitamin C, which is the kind of the citric acid experience you're getting.
Right.
So it's immensely medicinal, and good for your immune
Yeah.
system and everything.
Yeah, great survival food.
Hmm.
Apparently, if anybody watches Alone, it seems like they're
Oh,
always
that's
eating
funny.
rose hips.
Yeah.
um, well, can you talk a little bit about the boons that you talk about on the website?
Oh yeah. Um, well, that goes back to Colin and I connecting. It sort of started with these kind of human stories that we connected through, and the discoveries you make. It sort of when you're in the orchard, it kind of it changes your imagination. If you go there, then when you leave, you notice that different things or different values or different buried stories of characters. Like Colin was saying, it's sort of a treasure hunt because you know we live in a world in the United States where certain narratives are valued or told, through education channels. So it's really groundbreaking when you find alternative versions, again, like indigenous or
Yeah.
And so it was just sort of fun, using these multivalent narratives of the history of California, which of course was Mexico not long ago, and then before that, indigenous. So there's so much recent yet forgotten evidence of these platitudes of perspectives, and so that's what sort of, you feel like you're speaking on behalf of them in a way when you start getting in the dirt and sort of finding the orchards themselves that have been forgotten or neglected. Seems like a metaphor for these cool characters that you discover.
Yeah, I love that. How did you choose to highlight the ones that you have highlighted? Can I read something from your website, because I think it's just well written?
Sure.
I'll quote you guys back to you. Making cider. This is from your website. Making cider. We are visited by a chorus of characters from the past. Music rises from the underworld through the terroir. During winemaking, visionary visitations, costumed as plants, fruit, and soil, conjure the figures of history, simultaneously long dead and resurrected. And then and that's just a snippet. It goes on, but you give some highlights of some cool, I mean, I assume cool characters. And I don't know if you want to talk about one or two of those, or how you chose the characters that are there, how they came into your world.
Yeah, well, let me pull it up real quick.
I'm just thinking out loud while there's a pause, when we're, prior to Bardos and into Bardos, being out in the orchards and just sort of imagining this place that we live in through the layers of history, and sort of imagining what life might have been like, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, in the spot that you're sort of, in the moment. And through that, we're constantly researching stories and history of all these different people that have lived here in California, and maybe elsewhere, but and finding the relationships within those stories to our present moment. And there are just many different characters that were part of California history that it's creating Bardos is sort of a vehicle to tell their stories.
I
Yeah.
love that. I really want to incorporate that, because there's some great, I mean, I have some hero, I would just refer to them as heroes, but I like the term boons better. It's a little more humanizing in a way, and also magicalizing in another way.
Yeah.
But I feel that down here too, and I really want to bring some of those people to attention too. People like Biddy Mason, who's like a Los Angeles sort of character that I don't think enough people know about. She's just got an amazing story.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then and people, even her story is intertwined with other people that I think have really interesting parts to play, both in her story but just on their own. And and there's many more than that. That's just one example. But yeah, I love this idea, and I love the sort of respect that it pays. And I also love that when you have that sense of history that sounds like you guys have, it's like you kind of especially you're working with apples that predate the Industrial Revolution. Well, not exactly, but are as old as it. And you can see how brief a time all of this excitement that we currently live in has occupied. How very brief of a window of time what we think of as like the dominant world has been the dominant world. It's just a little blip in time. And yeah, I know there's something very liberating and encouraging about that. I was going to ask you guys about what you guys do to avoid cynicism to these days, in your approach to cider making and in your business, but maybe just in general as well.
I mean, I'll just say, having these figures as sort of symbols, they help, because you feel like you're working in service of them, or in devotion to them. So you just got to follow the clues they've given you, and then it definitely unfolds. I mean, I think Colin and Jackie and Evan and I, our conversations have evolved, and the business itself, is is we're realizing a business too. So it's its own entity. So all these figures that lured us into the orchards and stuff, and spirits and playful kind of experiences, are almost kind of growing up in a funny way. And I think we've been talking a lot more about, like, what is just basic, what does farming mean for these orchards. It's become a little less about some of the characters and more like, wow, we gotta save these orchards. It's almost like, if you really get out of your own way, all of these characters kind of like little fairies or something, like brought us here, but there's actually a bigger job to be done, which I think is to figure out, how to save old things, that require much less water, that require much less work. How do we pay people? Respect. How do we scale this thing in order to pay people, in order to make a product that really triumphs and advocates for dry farmed things, and pesticide free things, and things that aren't there's no sulfites, so it's a living product that helps your microbiology, and things that we're just learning about now. And I think, to go back to what you were saying about these characters that you want to tell stories about, all that stuff kind of comes through storytelling. And it's like, in a very literal way, those characters comprise the soil that is making the product that we're creating. So it's this sort of narrative loop. But I think what we're realizing now is that they've called us to do something that I think that was bigger than we realized initially.
I like that, and I love that you brought up the scale thing, because I've been thinking a lot more about that as well. Like I think I mentioned, that Chris Newman, the guy that I've been listening to, and one of his big criticisms of like the regenerative movement, regenerative agriculture movement, is that is it really going to change anything to have a bunch of small farms doing good work? I mean, it's great that they're doing that. It's not to take away from that, but does that move the needle? And I think the answer may be no. We might need to stop being precious about our little thing. I mean, I'm speaking to myself here, not to you guys or anybody else, but I may need to get out of my little small thinking and start thinking about how to move this to a bigger scale that actually can affect change in a way that's more meaningful, and that that more people can get on board with, because it's viable in a way that we're talking about millions and millions of people who are interacting with it, versus a couple hundred or whatever. Because I think those are the scales that we live in now. And yeah,
I mean, I would say the just awareness of where our food comes from, has in my perspectives, some of us have lost, including myself before I came back to Sonoma. I just really was not aware of what was going into my body. And
right.
there is a big movement, obviously, to take better care of ourselves and, be aware of those, what's going on with our food and what we're ingesting, and applying that to Bardos. We're really focused on, fruit trees that, are, have been there for a long time, and promoting, not spraying, trying to, just inspire or raise awareness about, the unnecessaries of,
Right.
industrial farming. And, it's important for us to be aware of what we put into our bodies. And, so making Bardos for me is, it's something that I want to drink. I know that we didn't do a lot to it. One question, is it good for you? Maybe.
Well, I always think, I had that conversation with somebody at a liquor store once where I was like, "Do you have any organic whiskey?" And they're like, "I don't think so." And they're like, "But it doesn't matter. It gets distilled so many times, you're not really getting." And I was like, I honestly don't care what I'm putting into my body. I care what I'm putting into the world, Like that's why I ask. It's, whether my health is impacted or not, if it's grown without those chemicals, then the world is not receiving those chemicals and the environment isn't receiving those chemicals. And ultimately, I think that's healthy for me,
Yeah, totally.
And everyone else, it has a much bigger impact, rather than just whatever I'm consuming at that moment. So I love that. Well, you guys, I really, it sounds like there's I really appreciate the sort of very thoughtful and, I hate to use the word spiritual, but I don't know how else to put it, kind of approach that you guys have to cider making. It sounds very California to use.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a joke because we do use that word a lot, just trying to normalize it almost because.
Good for you. Good. All right.
But there's also the euphemism, of course. I mean, it's not a distilled spirit, but
right. Yeah, that's always fun. The double entendre.
Yeah.
So I found out about you guys, strangely enough, here in Culver City, just a few miles from my house, at a place called the Jolly Oyster, where they serve some really nice stuff and wines and I was like, by any chance do you guys have a cider? And they're like, yeah, but it's really dry. And I was like, perfect. Like, please let me have that. Almost like apologetically. And it was like a, what is it? I don't even think, was it a 500 milliliter? Is that what you guys are bottling in?
But 5 and 750s. Yeah.
So
a lot of the
it was
19,
a 5. Yeah.
All the 19 was 500, I think. And then,
so it was a 500 and popped that on the way home and was like, Wendy was driving me home, of course. But I was like, oh my God, like, I think I just discovered something really good. And, it just had all the hallmarks of a really distinctive, naturally made, just lovely experience, unique and alive and really wonderful. So compliments on that. It was the mestizo. I don't know what you guys call it. It has mestizo on the label.
Yeah.
Is it yellow or green?
I think it was green.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What's that one?
That's our Winter Walker.
Yeah, those are
Winter
later varietals.
Mm-hmm.
Is that inspired by Game of Thrones by any chance?
No,
Winter Walker.
No. I've never seen Game of Thrones, actually. I'm intimidated.
I have.
Well,
have you, Colin?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Whew.
And your website is bardoscider.com. I'm just going to shout that out. Is there other ways that you get out in the world or want people to interact with you?
I think that's it for now. I mean, we have this distribution in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Illinois, and New York, and then through New York, Maine, and Massachusetts. But because we are making it a decent amount, and it's still we're sort of educating people about cider, and it's a pretty stigmatized medium. So it's one light bulb at a time that goes off.
Yeah, it's so crazy. I know, just even the people selling it were sort of selling it to me apologetically. I mean, I love that. They've been great. I think it was the wine person wasn't there who sold me that, so it was like one of their regular servers, and was like, yeah, it's really dry, and I was like, okay.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's funny.
I will have that, please.
Yeah, that's funny.
It's like that sounds like real cider is what you're trying to tell me.
Yeah. There was a sparkling wine person from California in the 60s or 70s who I stumbled on something. They worked with a certain Pinot variety, like an old, trying to trace the origin of that varietal. But anyways, they were they had this whole sort of story of their experience with making sparkling wine in California, which was that it was years and years of educating people that sparkling wine didn't have to be pink and sweet. It could be a elevated,
Right. Yeah.
pairing wine,
Right.
which was just unheard of. And it's, that's kind of what we're experiencing with cider. But it's really, it never gets old watching people have that experience that we've all had, where
Yeah.
where the doors are blown open and you realize, wow, this is a whole other, playing field here.
Yeah. Yep. That is a fun thing. I guess that's why I'm so excited about cider, because I've had that more recently. Like with wine, that happened to me much longer ago.
Yeah.
But cider, I feel like it's more recent, and I feel like it happens more often where I'm tasting ciders that, again, I think it's the culture of ciders, people who are using these things that have been a lot of times, on the East Coast, they're just feral, they're like in the national forest or,
Well, that's the other thing.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. So
And then,
technically, we sort of use the word gleaning more, and there you're foraging because they grow
right,
wild there. We'll
right,
get seedling apples on the edge of the orchard and stuff. They will grow a bit wild up in the Sierras, but on the East Coast, I mean, they're everywhere.
yeah, yeah. It's like, yeah, like part of the forest, really.
Exactly. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, and that, I mean, and then, yeah, but still, it's just like these kind of experiences are not the kind of wine that you get. Like
Hmm.
wine is not from these marginal sort of wild spaces. It's from very cultivated areas usually,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's usually a very cultivated experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I'm very excited, or more excited recently with more ciders, because it's like you're getting these things. You're just like, wow, this is so specific. It's so unique.
Yeah, it's cool. Everybody, that's the other thing is people say like, so who's your competition? It's like, I mean, nobody, because the more we normalize this, the more broader of an audience we'll get,
Yeah,
and the more nuanced it is. I mean, it's just fun trying different ones. I mean, they're all really unique when people are
yeah,
doing it, authentic ways.
right. And I mean, and there's a good number who are, which
Yeah,
is the
no,
great
it's
thing. Yeah,
super
it's
cool. And
almost attracts you types.
yeah.
um, well, thank you so much for this. It's really great getting to know you, and hopefully getting some other people to know you. Is any closing words about what you do and why you do it, or
I,
what you'd like people to know about you that we haven't covered?
I mean, I think that we're constantly searching for historical orchards. I have one story I could quickly share about
Yeah,
our
please.
our last collaboration that we did with Wavy, and there was an old homestead with a bunch of apple trees, where we went and picked the apples, and that cider's in barrel. But we had another experience out in the Mendocino forest where at one point in history, I guess they clear cut most of the redwood forest out there, and
Hmm.
they had the idea of turning all the land into pasture land. And so
Mm,
there was some sort of connection between UC Davis and this area where UC Davis planted all these apple trees in this new pasture land. And then over time, the redwood forest grew back, and there's just
mhm.
a plethora of old apple trees out in the redwoods of
Yeah,
Mendocino.
wow.
And so, for anybody who might be listening, we're looking for these types of orchards, or stories, buried stories in California history in the landscape. And um, so we're open to finding new orchards, new places, and telling their stories.
And is the website the best way to contact you with anything like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
bardoscider.com.
Yeah. And also, if I mean, I think a new goal on the horizon is yeah, how to preserve these derelict orchards that in California are a hot commodity for real estate. So if there's a way to kind of
Mm,
advocate for these, because they get bulldozed one by one. I mean, there's a lot of them still, but at this rate, we're going to lose them all for vineyards that it takes a pretty
Are
enormous
heavily
carbon footprint to bulldoze and a 50-acre orchard and plant all that stuff
and then they're putting in irrigation with those.
Yeah, so
just wasted.
I think there's enough, and yet they're ripping out other vineyards. So that's sort of the narrative that we're interested in exploring, is how do we use what we have, and how do we advocate for what we have. I mean, in wine, you see all these varietals becoming cool again, that were sort of out of vogue, and I think that's something to really focus on, is using what we have, and really looking around you, seeing what's in your community. It inspires you to talk to your neighbors or talk to people you don't know, and instead of having this kind of like design approach, you sort of have this sort of documentary approach or something, where you're really just kind of capturing what already exists. You're not building from the ground up.
It's not so much an ego expression as a reflection, working in service of something, rather than trying to imprint your ego desires onto something.
Yeah, because if you look at the world that way, I mean, there is an abundance around us all.
Yeah.
It may not be what in your mind's eye you wanted, but you'll be surprised if there's a reciprocity with your community environment, that there's so much potential.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good parting shot, I think. You guys, thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation, and unexpected, and I think a really good introduction to you. I hope.
Yeah.
I hope.